All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. We have chapter 8 here today, and we have a couple of things to talk about. Not an immensely dense chapter, but a chapter that is going to bridge the gap between our first couple of presidents and then kind of a new era, which we'll talk about. So let's pick up with the end of last chapter, and the end of last chapter really talked about the end of the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate, and we know that. However, the end of the War of 1812 also brought about the Hartford Convention. And if you remember the Hartford Convention, that led to the death of the Federalists. Okay, the Federalist Party was deemed unpatriotic, and they were not going to be very popular. People were very upset with them. The War of 1812 ended, and everybody pointed the finger at them as being, un-American, unpatriotic, and not having faith in Madison. So it leads to the death of the Federalists. So now, from about 1814 till about 1824, we're going to have a relatively peaceful time politically because you're only going to have the Democratic Republicans. Okay, and these Democratic Republicans, we're going to see a couple of things happen. First of all, we'll see James Monroe take the oath of office after James Madison. The reason it's called the era of good feelings is because not only there's one political party and that's uncontested essentially, as you can see in the political map there of 1820, but also the couple of other things that are going on. You see a high sense of nationalism or patriotism, and then you're going to see some good things and then also some underlying bad things happen. So we'll talk about some of the good things in a moment with Henry Clay and the American system, but other things we're going to see is things like sectionalism. All right, sectionalism is something that is going to start to tear our country apart to the point where we're going to have a civil war. Sectionalism is a new term for us, and obviously we're going to talk about it for a while now, the next few weeks. Sectionalism means that you have a loyalty to your section of the country. There are 3 sections of the country: North, South, and then the brand new section of the country, the West. Okay, and we'll talk more about those sections as we go on these next few weeks. The other issues that are going to start to drag us apart are things like slavery. Okay, and we'll talk about what happens with Missouri. And then the other thing that happens during this time period, there is a panic. A panic usually refers to a recession, and a panic usually is occurring because of speculation. Now, speculation means, think about what the definition of being a speculator means is, you're speculating, you're predicting something to happen. Now, when you are a speculator on land, it means that you're buying land, usually out here in the West, and you're speculating that you buy a bunch of land and you're kind of taking a gamble that you can sell it off in smaller parcels to make a profit. And that works, obviously, if you get to sell it out. But if you don't get to sell it, well, then obviously your plan backfires. And that's what happens here in 1819. Too many people are going out west, buying big chunks of land, thinking that they're able to sell it, and then nobody wants to buy it. And that's what happens there in the panic of 1819. Okay, so we talked about that. Let's talk about some of the political giants, okay, the war hawks that are voted into office in 1811 in Congress. We're going to talk more about these guys over the next few weeks. Guys like John C. Calhoun, who's going to represent the South, who we'll talk more about during the Andrew Jackson chapter next week as Vice President. Daniel Webster, we'll talk more about him next week as well with the banks, but he represents the North. And then Henry Clay, this guy is never going to go away, seemingly, all the way up to the Civil War. So we'll talk way more about him. But speaking of Henry Clay and his American system, he comes up with a plan, an economic plan. It has 3 major components, okay? First component is, why don't we pass a protective tariff? Now, if you remember from a couple weeks ago, a tariff is a tax on imports, and we do this as an incentive for Americans to buy American-made goods. It makes those foreign-made goods more expensive, okay? So again, I think I gave the analogy of an iPhone, where you have the Chinese iPhone, $1,000, the American-made iPhone, $800. They're the exact same phone, but being there's a tariff on the Chinese-made one, you're inclined to buy the American-made one, which then the money goes into our economy. So he says, Henry Clay, why don't we do that? He also says, why don't we re-up the Bank of the United States? Hamilton was the first guy to come up with the first national bank, but he's now dead, he's gone. And that bank was only for 20 years, okay? It was a 20-year charter. And now the 20 years is up in 1816, and so they said, why don't we re-up the bank, have it again? It worked out the first time, let's do it again. All right. Component number 3 of Henry Clay's plan, internal improvements. He wants federal money, or in this case, it's going to be state money that's going to be funded to build projects throughout the country as it'll help us expand. Okay, things like roads, the national roads that'll connect the states, things like canals, like the Erie Canal that's going to help with trade. And so these are some of the things. These 3 components are part of his American system. Now, I would like you to remember that we could see this being compared to another financial plan of the past. A couple weeks ago, we talked about a financial plan that had 4 components. One that had a protective tariff, and the other had a bank. And that would be Hamilton's plan. So Hamilton's plan is very similar. The first 2 components are same. However, Henry Clay has an idea for internal improvements, and instead Hamilton had a plan for a tax on whiskey and also the assumption plan for national debt. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the themes that are going to actually start to tear the country apart, and that brings us to the talk about Missouri. So Missouri is a territory that was part of the original Louisiana territory, and now it wants to become a state. The problem is that we have a balance of free states and slave states in the Union. And the reason that's a big deal is because of representation in Congress. If we add Missouri to the Union, whether it's going to be free or slave, regardless, it's going to upset that balance. And that means one side, meaning the slavery or non slavery states, are going to have more of a say in Congress, and they don't want that. So, we have an issue. Missouri wants into the Union, and they have already come out and say they want to be a slave state because they have some plantations and slavery is abundant there. So they say, okay, why don't we do this? Why don't we pass this thing called the Talmadge Amendment, where we are going to make Missouri enter the Union as a slave state, and the kids, the children of slaves, will be born free, which means over the course of time, slavery would die out, and you see a gradual emancipation. The South, as you can think, would not be in favor of this. The Talmadge Amendment does not pass. So we have a mess still. What happens? Henry Clay once again comes in to save the day. He has a compromise. He says, okay, Missouri, you're in as a slave state. He says to keep the balance, we're going to enter Maine as a free state. Maine has always been part of the Union. However, they were always part of Massachusetts. So they break away from Massachusetts and become their own state. Voila, we now have 12 and 12, okay, the same amount of free and slave states in the Union. The third and last component, very important that you know this part too, is that they draw a line called a 3630 line. That's this little red line right here, and I'll show it to you in a minute on a bigger map. That line says from here on out, okay, everything else in the Louisiana territory, because again, we don't know that we're going to get all this from Spain eventually, but it says everything else in the Louisiana territory, everything above this 3630 line, okay, all this pink land right here, from here on out will be free, no matter what kind of states we have. And then everything below it, which would be Arkansas, okay, and a little piece of Oklahoma, will be slave. That's the line they draw. And I'll show it to you on a map, okay, a little bit bigger right here. So That's the third component, all right? And so for now, this solves the issue of slavery in Congress and representation, and it keeps the balance of power between slave and free states. Missouri in as slave, Maine in as free, 3630 line, cuts basically the Louisiana Territory, not really in half, obviously very unfortunate, but says everything above it from here on out that will enter the Union will be free, everything below it will be slave. So everything is peaceful. We avoid civil war. Okay, we don't head into catastrophe just yet. Obviously, down the road, though. So stay tuned. Now let's talk about one of the more important and prominent Secretary of States that our country has had thus far in our short amount of time, and that is the son of John Adams, okay, John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, he is a very well-educated man. He spent a lot of his time abroad when he was young, learning and going to schools in different countries. He knows multiple languages. He is, once he becomes Secretary of State, he is a foreign policy guru. Now, what does he do that's so well? He's able to negotiate with other countries and get them to kind of concede or agree to give us things. Things like the Oregon Territory, okay, the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, where we jointly agree to occupy Oregon country, all this yellow territory, with England, because we want it for things like fishing and timber and beaver pelts and stuff like that. The other thing that he does is more importantly, I should say, is he gets the Adams-Onis Treaty passed in 1819. This allows us to buy Florida. Florida was a little controversial because Florida was owned by Spain. They outlawed slavery, which means you see a lot of slaves in the South trying to run away to Florida. You will see future President Andrew Jackson actually go down there because he is a slave owner himself, and he will actually kind of go over on a rampage where he starts killing a bunch of um, Native Americans and Spanish and even a couple of British people. And he almost causes a war because of his actions, which were unsanctioned by the United States, by the way. However, John Quincy Adams comes in, saves the day, he says, "Hey, Spain, we don't want to go to war. Why don't we just buy Florida from you, and Florida will enter the Union as a slave state." Okay, so that obviously is okay with the South. Okay, you can read more about those components on your own. Okay, here's the Adams-Onis Treaty. We are formally giving up our claims to Texas, by the way, which, as we know, that's only temporary. All right, there's John Quincy Adams with the sideburns there. And again, you can read more about specifics of his foreign policy triumphs, if you will. Okay, that leads us to pretty much the last major part of this topic, and that's the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening is just like the First Great Awakening. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a religious revival, except not in the colonies, now in the United States. And there is one really main guy that we're going to associate with the Second Great Awakening and trying to get people more religious, and that's this guy on the slide, Charles Finney. Charles Finney is a preacher who starts in New York and then heads out to the frontier, and that's what this picture is, him preaching and, kind of like a makeshift little, not a church, but, actually outside on a stage, and you can see the tents in the background, and he gets a lot of people into religion, and you see a religious revival here in the 1830s, 40s. And so he is an interesting guy. He is against a couple things, like against slavery and against alcohol, which is interesting because we're going to talk about the biggest reason we talk about the Second Great Awakening is because it prompts other reform movements. So stay tuned for a second. Other new religious sects are formed, like the Methodist and Baptist Church, which are very increasingly popular in the South, especially among slaves, which we'll talk more about in the next few weeks as well. Charles Finney, stressed personal conversion. Okay, wants people to convert to the church. Says you're not predestined. You don't have your fate's not written in the stars. You have control of your fate, which some people were under the impression that they were damned or doomed from the beginning. But he does also offer more democratic control of church affairs, and part of that allowing more people to be involved is letting women be involved in the church. And that's interesting because that's going to have an effect now on some future reform movements that we're about to get into. Okay, so I mentioned a minute ago that the Second Great Awakening, the biggest reason we talk about it is that it prompts other reform movements. So let's talk about and mention some of the reform movements. We're only going to touch on a few now, and we'll talk more about more of them in a couple of weeks when we get into more specifics about those reform movements. But let's just introduce this. So first of all, the Second Great Awakening introduces many reform movements like the prison reform movement, which we'll see, temperance, which is mentioned in this chapter, the women's rights movement, and anti-slavery. Now, the reason it's a catalyst for other reform movements is for two reasons. One, I mentioned women are more involved in the church now. They're promoted to be more involved, and so women are going to be more involved in their own movement and want more of a say in not only the church, but in government and society. And also, we said Charles Finney does preach things like temperance and anti-slavery. So you're going to see the abolitionist movement start to pick up. You're going to see the temperance movement start to pick up with Lyman Beecher, as we'll see in a second. Okay, so that's kind of what we were talking about down here, where we talk about women having more of a role in society and more democratic control in the church, and that kind of boils over into society, if you will. So the temperance movement, temperance was a big issue. The abolition of alcohol or prohibition, if you will. This is a movement that begins very early on. It's seen almost as a immigrant problem because many immigrants that are coming over in the 1840s are from Ireland and Germany, where drinking is viewed very differently over there. And so a lot of these immigrants are going to be seen as drunkards. And again, kind of seen as an immigrant problem, and that's going to lead to a lot of nativism, which we'll talk about what that term means in the next few weeks as well. Okay, but it's basically kind of a prejudice towards, these immigrants. We are going to see drinking become a problem when we start to have factories, right? You can't go to work and be drunk and man a machine. That's not good. Family life, right? You don't want, the male in the home coming home drunk and disrupting the household. Okay, so there's many reasons why the temperance movement starts to pick up, not just because, women wanted to. You're going to see the American Temperance Society form. That's going to be a future vocabulary term. Their message is very clear cut and simple. They urge members to stop drinking, to go to a dry. Their message is dry, meaning no alcohol. They are going to eventually start to push for a legal amendment or a law that prohibits the buying, selling, or consuming of alcohol. And just to give you an example, you don't necessarily have to know this, but there is a law, the first prohibition law in the United States actually happened in Maine in 1851, which prohibits the manufacture and sale of liquor. And it's not until the 18th Amendment in the 1920s where we actually do see a nationwide amendment, happen, which is about 80 years later. So we'll stay tuned to that. Now, speaking about men having more of a say in society and definitely having a say in the temperance movement, women, what is their view or what are they viewed to be doing at this time? What are they supposed to be doing according to society? Society views them as being part of the household, to be part of what they call the cult of domesticity, to stay at home and child rear and take care of the home and cook dinner and things like that. And sticking with that term, cult domesticity, being at home, and I mentioned child rearing, they're supposed to, according to society, also raise the children to be good citizens, okay, good Republicans, not the political party, but the sense of a good Republican citizen, okay, and Republican motherhood is another important term. These two terms are very important. You must know them. We're going to see these time and time again as we talk more about the women's rights movement in the next following weeks. We're always going to come back to where women were and what their view in society was when our country began. And these two terms really identify what was expected of women early on. So make sure you know them. Okay, we're almost done with the chapter here. The Supreme Court, one last thing is under John Marshall at this time. John Marshall is going to expand the role of the Supreme Court and basically find them more power. Cases that basically represent that idea, that theme that I just mentioned, Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court realizes their power of judicial review. So that was a case we definitely have to know. You do not have to know these two cases. Supreme Court cases are not in our curriculum anymore. So the few that we do mention, I definitely would know. But if you do go on to AP Politics next year, these would be cases that you'd be expected to know. So anyways, how do these reflect John Marshall expanding the power of the Supreme Court? McCullough versus Maryland basically says that a state cannot tax a federal agency when talking about the BUS as the Bank of the United States. So that is giving more power to the federal government because states are not allowed to tax a federal agency. A federal agency, as we know, or a federal law has more power over a state. Gibbons versus Ogden, giving more power to the federal government as well because this rules the federal government, in this case Congress, can regulate interstate commerce. Remember, Articles of Federation didn't work out when every state had control or different laws of trade. Gibbons versus Ogden says, we need to make sure the federal government has control of interstate commerce because if you give the states the power and the control, it's a mess, okay? And you can't have states having their own rules. All right. Again, you don't really have to know McCullough versus Maryland or Gibbons versus Ogden. They're just examples of the idea that the Supreme Court becomes more powerful and more power is given to this federal branch under the John Marshall Court. All right. Now that is it for our chapter. We are going to end there, and hopefully this you found helpful. If you liked it, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, I'll see you next week.